The silent alarm. The morning air hung heavy with humidity as Darius Durant, a young postman in the small town of Brookfield, prepped for another day on his familiar route. It was a route he had come to know like the back of his hand, where he greeted neighbors with the same warmth they returned to him. The routine offered a certain comfort, the kind that was welcome, yet sometimes made him feel like he was going through the motions of a life that had long since settled into place. As he looked at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, splashing cold water on his face, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling of stagnation. Something was missing from his life, though he couldn't quite place what it was. Still, he donned his postal uniform with a sense of quiet pride, the deep blue fabric representing more than just a paycheck. It connected him to the community, to people like Mrs. Davis, who baked him cookies every Christmas, and Mr. Rodriguez, who loved chatting about baseball. Yet, despite these connections, he felt distant from something greater. Another day, another delivery, he muttered under his breath as he grabbed his keys and headed out into the humid morning. The town of Brookfield was beginning to stir as Darius slid into the driver's seat of his worn postal van, the steering wheel soft under his fingers from years of use. As he started his route, the usual faces greeted him. Early risers watering their gardens, joggers passing by with earbuds in place, and children chasing each other on their bikes before the real heat of the day set in. Halfway through his route, he paused for a moment to review the next batch of mail. As he flipped through envelopes, one name caught his eye. Mrs. Elmore Parsons. She lived on the far side of town, tucked away in a quaint, single-story house near the woods. It had been at least a week, maybe two, since Darius had seen her. In a town as small as Brookfield, you noticed when someone wasn't around, especially an elderly widow who lived alone. The last time he had delivered a package to her, she'd been her usual pleasant self, offering him a cool glass of lemonade while they exchanged pleasantries on her porch. As Darius pulled up to Mrs. Parsons' house, something felt off right away. The yard, which she usually kept in meticulous condition, was overgrown, with weeds overtaking the flower beds and leaves scattered across the porch. He frowned, his sense of unease growing. Stepping out of his van, Darius glanced at the stack of old newspapers piled haphazardly on her porch. A week's worth, maybe more. Mrs. Parsons had always been prompt in collecting her papers, and this sudden lapse was alarming. He swallowed hard as he walked up the steps and rang the doorbell. The chime echoed inside the house, but no movement followed. "Mrs. Parsons," he called, knocking firmly on the door. Still, nothing. Darius hesitated, feeling the weight of the situation pressing on him. He knocked again, louder this time, but was met only with silence. Suddenly, a sound, a faint scraping, reached his ears. It was coming from inside the house. Leaning closer to the door, Darius strained to hear more clearly. The scraping continued, followed by a low groan. His heart began to race, his postal routine suddenly forgotten. "I'm coming in," he announced, unsure if Mrs. Parsons could even hear him, but hoping the sound of his voice might reach her if she was in trouble. The front door was unlocked, and it creaked ominously as he pushed it open. The smell hit him first, a pungent odor, sharp and sour. His stomach turned, but he forced himself to move forward. Inside, the house was dim, the curtains drawn tightly against the sunlight, casting long shadows across the floor. The living room, usually neat and tidy, was in disarray. Books and papers lay scattered, and a blanket was draped haphazardly across the couch. "Mrs. Parsons." Darius called again, his voice wavering slightly as he moved deeper into the house. His footsteps echoed eerily in the silence. He rounded the corner into the kitchen and froze. There, slumped over at the table, was Mrs. Parsons. Her usually pristine appearance was shockingly disheveled. Her once white hair, always neatly pinned, was tangled and greasy. She wore a stained nightgown that clung to her frail form, and her face was pale, almost ashen. She didn't move when Darius entered the room, didn't even look up. "Mrs. Parsons," he repeated, louder this time, as he rushed to her side. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes half-lidded, as if she was barely aware of his presence. Darius quickly checked her pulse. Weak, but there. Relief flooded through him, but it was quickly replaced by panic. "I'm going to get help," he said, pulling his phone from his pocket with trembling hands. His fingers fumbled as he dialed 911. The operator answered immediately, and Darius quickly relayed what he had found, his voice tight with urgency. "She's breathing, but barely. I don't know how long she's been like this. Please, send someone fast." The operator assured him help was on the way, and Darius stayed on the line, watching over Mrs. Parsons as she lay motionless in her chair. His heart pounded in his chest, fear and adrenaline coursing through his veins. He couldn't help but wonder what had happened. She had always seemed so healthy, so independent. What could have caused such a sudden and drastic decline? The minutes dragged on, feeling like an eternity until he heard the distant wail of sirens approaching. He rushed to the front door, flinging it open just as the paramedics arrived. He directed them to the kitchen, where Mrs. Parsons still sat, unresponsive but alive. As the paramedics worked, checking her vitals and preparing to transport her to the hospital, Darius stepped back, his mind racing. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him. Mrs. Parsons had always been so self-sufficient, so strong. For her to end up in such a state, there had to be more to the story. And as he watched the paramedics load her onto the stretcher, a deep sense of dread settled in his gut. Darius knew that whatever had happened to Mrs. Parsons wasn't just a medical emergency. It was something darker, something that had been hiding beneath the surface for far too long. The signs of something wrong. Darius couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had taken root in his chest since the morning encounter at Mrs. Thompson's house. Even as he tried to push forward with his deliveries, the image of her overgrown yard and the pile of untouched newspapers haunted him. The mail van, once a space of comfort and routine, now felt suffocating as his thoughts drifted back to the elderly woman again and again. The streets of Copper Hill passed by in a blur of familiar faces and houses, but none of it seemed to register. Darius's mind was too preoccupied with the gnawing sense that something wasn't right. By the time his lunch break arrived, he wasn't even hungry, a stark contrast to his usual enthusiasm for Mabel's diner. As he parked his van outside the small, cozy diner, Darius could already smell the rich aroma of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee wafting through the air. Normally, this was his favorite part of the day. Mabel's was more than just a place to eat. It was a second home for much of the Copper Hill community. Here, he could relax, swap stories with other locals, and unwind before the second half of his route. But today, even as the familiar bell jingled above the door and Mabel greeted him with her usual cheery smile, the knot in his stomach refused to loosen. "Hey there, Darius," Mabel called out from behind the counter, her apron dusted with flour. "The usual?" Darius forced a smile and nodded as he slid into his regular booth by the window, but his mind was miles away. While Mabel busied herself in the kitchen, Darius absent-mindedly stared out the window, watching the townsfolk go about their day. His thoughts kept circling back to Mrs. Thompson. It wasn't like her to let her house fall into disrepair, and the fact that she hadn't been seen in weeks was troubling. "Here you go, darlin'," Mabel interrupted his thoughts, placing a plate of pancakes and bacon in front of him, along with a steaming cup of coffee. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Everything all right?" Darius hesitated, unsure if he should voice his concerns or if he was just overreacting. He took a sip of coffee, the warmth settling in his throat, but it did nothing to ease the chill of unease. "I don't know, Mabel," he finally said, pushing his food around on his plate. "It's Mrs. Thompson. You know her, right? Lives over on Elm Street." Mabel nodded, her brow furrowing in concern as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Of course. Sweet lady. Why? Something happened?" "I don't know," Darius admitted. "That's the thing. I haven't seen her in weeks, and neither has her neighbor. Her yard's a mess, mail's piled up, and the house just looks off. Mabel's expression turned serious. That doesn't sound like her at all. She's always been so particular about keeping everything in order. You think she might be out of town? I thought about that, Darius said, leaning forward. But if she was, wouldn't someone have been taking care of her place, or at least collecting her mail? Mabel pursed her lips, clearly sharing his unease. You've got a point. Maybe she's sick or something. Have you tried knocking again? Or calling? Darius shook his head. I knocked a couple times this morning, but no answer. The house was dead quiet. The two sat in silence for a moment, the usual hum of the diner feeling unusually distant. Mabel's concern mirrored his own, and it only reinforced Darius's growing sense that something was terribly wrong. Well, I can give the sheriff a call if you're really worried, Mabel offered, her tone gentle but firm. Might be worth having someone check in on her. Darius nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. Yeah, maybe that's a good idea. I'd hate to think something happened to her and no one knew. I'll call as soon as you head out, Mabel assured him. You take care now, all right? Darius left the diner with a sense of purpose, feeling a little less weighed down by the worry that had been gnawing at him all morning. As he climbed back into his van, he took a deep breath and started the engine, determined to finish the rest of his route with a clear head. But as the afternoon wore on and he dropped off the last of his deliveries, the nagging thought of Mrs. Thompson crept back in. What if Mabel was right? What if she was sick or hurt, or worse? By the time Darius pulled his van into the post office at the end of the day, the sun was already dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet town. Normally, this would be the part of his day where he clocked out, maybe stopped by the grocery store before heading home to unwind. But something inside him wouldn't let him just walk away. Not tonight. He stood outside his van for a moment, the keys jingling in his hand as he debated what to do. Mabel had said she'd call the sheriff, but there was no telling when, or if, they would show up. And what if Mrs. Thompson really was in danger? What if every minute counted? The thought was enough to spur him into action. Before he could second-guess himself, Darius hopped back into his van and drove towards Elm Street. The streets were quiet now, most of the town already settling in for the night. As he pulled up in front of Mrs. Thompson's house, the unease from the morning returned with full force. The house looked even more forlorn in the fading light. The once vibrant flower beds were overrun with weeds, and the curtains in the windows were drawn tight. The mailbox was still stuffed full, and the pile of newspapers had grown even larger since this morning. Darius stepped out of the van and made his way up the front path, his heart pounding in his chest. He knocked again, louder this time, hoping for any sign of movement inside. Mrs. Thompson, he called out, his voice slightly shaky. It's Darius from the post office. Are you all right? Silence. He knocked again, harder this time, but still no response. The house remained eerily still, and Darius felt a knot tighten in his gut. After a few more moments of fruitless knocking, Darius made a decision. He reached for the doorknob, hesitating for just a second before turning it. To his surprise, the door creaked open with little resistance. Mrs. Thompson, he called out again, stepping into the darkened hallway. What greeted him on the other side sent a chill down his spine. The air inside the house was heavy, musty, like it hadn't been aired out in weeks. The curtains were all drawn, casting long shadows across the room, and the once tidy living room was in complete disarray. Furniture was upturned, papers were scattered across the floor, and the unmistakable scent of mildew clung to everything. Darius's heart raced as he stepped further inside, his eyes darting around for any sign of the elderly woman. His foot caught on something soft, and when he looked down, he saw a throw blanket that had been carelessly tossed to the floor. His breath hitched in his throat as he realized just how wrong everything felt. He ventured deeper into the house, moving cautiously as the creaking floorboards announced his every step. The kitchen was just as chaotic as the living room, with dishes piled high in the sink and stale food left out on the counter. A glass had fallen and shattered on the floor, the sharp pieces glinting in the dim light. And then he saw it, a trail of faint red stains leading towards the back of the house. Panic surged through Darius as he followed the trail, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. His pulse pounded in his ears as he approached the hallway that led to the bedrooms, his footsteps quickening despite his fear. "Mrs. Thompson," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty house. As he reached the end of the hallway, he froze. The door to the bedroom was ajar, and from the small gap, he could see the edge of a bed. Something was lying on the floor just beyond his line of sight. With his heart hammering in his chest, Darius pushed the door open, dreading what he might find on the other side. The unseen darkness. Darius's breath caught in his throat as the door swung open, revealing the darkened bedroom. The dim light from the hallway barely illuminated the room's interior, but what he could see immediately sent his pulse racing. The sight of an arm, thin, pale, unmoving, was draped across the floor just beyond the bed. His worst fears rushed to the forefront of his mind, but his body moved forward before his thoughts could slow him down. "Mrs. Thompson," he called out again, though his voice came out as a whisper barely audible even to his own ears. He rushed toward the figure on the floor, every muscle tensing with a growing sense of dread. As he rounded the bed, the frail body of Mrs. Thompson came fully into view. She was lying on her side, her nightgown wrinkled, and her gray hair spilling across the floor like a tangle of thin threads. Her face was turned away from him, but the stillness of her body was unmistakable. She wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. Darius dropped to his knees beside her, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch her shoulder. The moment his fingers brushed her skin, a jolt of cold shot through him. She was icy, far colder than anyone should be. His mind screamed at him to act, but his body felt locked in place, paralyzed by the shock, and the grim reality that he was too late. The silence of the house pressed in on him, suffocating. The only sound was his own rapid breathing as he tried to process what he was seeing. Mrs. Thompson, the sweet old woman who had waved to him every morning for years, was gone. For a few moments, all Darius could do was sit there, his hand still resting on her cold shoulder, his heart thudding in his chest. His mind spun with questions, none of which he had answers to. How long had she been like this? Why hadn't anyone noticed? Why hadn't anyone come to check on her sooner? Finally, the weight of responsibility settled over him, breaking through the fog of shock. He had to call someone. The sheriff? An ambulance? Anyone? With shaking hands, he fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy as he dialed the emergency number. The sound of the operator's voice on the other end felt distant, almost unreal, as he stammered out the details of what he had found. Yes, I'm at 112 Elm Street. I found her. I think she's gone. Mrs. Thompson. She's not breathing. She's cold. You need to send someone." His voice cracked as he spoke, and the operator's calm, methodical instructions barely registered in his mind. As the call ended, Darius stayed by Mrs. Thompson's side, feeling a strange sense of duty to not leave her alone until help arrived. His eyes wandered around the room, taking in the details he hadn't noticed before in his initial rush of panic. The bedroom was in as much disarray as the rest of the house. Drawers had been pulled open, clothes were strewn across the floor, and a bedside lamp lay shattered on the carpet. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just the home of an elderly woman who had passed away quietly in her sleep. This was something else, something darker. A soft sound broke through the silence, a creak, almost imperceptible, coming from somewhere deeper in the house. Darius's head snapped up, his breath hitching in his throat. For a moment, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him, but then he heard it again. A faint, shuffling noise, like something, or someone, moving in another room. He rose slowly to his feet, his eyes wide, his body instinctively tensing. Was someone else in the house? The thought sent a chill down his spine. He hadn't seen anyone when he first entered, but then again, he hadn't been paying attention to much of anything besides Mrs. Thompson. His heart pounded in his chest as he carefully backed away from the bedroom door, his ears straining to catch any more sounds. The shuffling had stopped, but the unease lingered thick and oppressive. Darius glanced down the hallway, his pulse quickening. The house was eerily quiet again, but the sense that something, or someone, was watching him was impossible to shake. His mind raced with possibilities. Could it be a burglar? An intruder who had ransacked the house and fled when he arrived? But if that were the case, why had they left so much behind? And why would they have harmed Mrs. Thompson? Taking a deep breath, Darius slowly moved toward the hallway, every step feeling heavier than the last. His senses were on high alert now, his eyes scanning every shadow for movement. He wished he had some kind of weapon, but all he had was his phone and a pen from his pocket. Hardly the kind of tools you'd want when investigating a potential threat. The living room loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. The dim light from the setting sun barely filtered through the thick curtains, casting long, ominous shadows across the floor. Darius paused at the edge of the hallway, his hand gripping the doorframe as he listened for any sign of life. Nothing. He let out a shaky breath and stepped into the living room, his eyes flicking from corner to corner. The overturned furniture and scattered papers only added to the sense of chaos, but there was no sign of anyone, or anything, that could explain the noise he had heard. For a moment, Darius considered the possibility that he was simply imagining things. After all, the shock of finding Mrs. Thompson in such a state was enough to mess with anyone's head. Maybe his mind was just playing tricks on him, amplifying every little creak and groan of the old house. But then, just as he was about to turn back toward the front door, something caught his eye. A glint of metal, partially hidden beneath a pile of papers on the coffee table. He moved closer, his heart racing, and reached out to lift the papers away. What he uncovered made his blood run cold. It was a small, ornate knife. The blade was thin, delicate even, but it was stained with something dark and dried. Blood. His stomach churned at the sight, and he instinctively recoiled, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. Mrs. Thompson had been attacked. This wasn't a simple accident or a natural death. Someone had been in her home, someone who had left this behind. His thoughts spiraled as he tried to make sense of it all. Who would want to hurt Mrs. Thompson? She was one of the kindest, most harmless people he had ever known. The idea that someone would deliberately harm her was unthinkable. Darius's hand shook as he carefully wrapped the knife in a nearby cloth, his mind racing with what to do next. Should he wait for the authorities and show them the knife? Or should he get out of the house before anything else happened? Before he could make a decision, the sound of footsteps, loud, unmistakable, echoed from the hallway. Darius froze, his eyes widening as the unmistakable sensation of being watched returned with full force. Someone else was in the house. Darius's heart pounded in his chest as he spun around, his eyes darting toward the hallway. The shadows seemed to shift, moving unnaturally in the dim light. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and Darius felt the overwhelming urge to run. He didn't wait to see who, or what, was approaching. He bolted for the front door, his heart racing as he fumbled with the lock. His hands were shaking, adrenaline flooding his system as the door finally swung open. Without looking back, Darius sprinted to his van, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. His chest heaved as he looked back toward the house, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing in the doorway. But there was nothing. Only the silent, dark house, looming ominously in the fading light. As he sat there, his hands still shaking on the steering wheel, Darius knew one thing for certain. Whatever had happened to Mrs. Thompson, it wasn't over. And whoever, or whatever, was responsible was still out there. And they knew he had seen too much. The gathering shadows. Darius sat frozen in his van, the engine idling as he stared at the house. His mind was racing, his body vibrating with the aftershock of adrenaline. What had just happened felt surreal, like a scene from a nightmare that refused to end. He could still feel the oppressive weight of the house behind him, the unseen presence that had made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. His thoughts collided with each other, trying to rationalize the impossible, but there was no sense to be made of it. The knife, the blood. Mrs. Thompson. He felt a cold sweat break out across his brow. Who had been in the house with him? And why had they killed her? These were the questions swirling in his mind as he gripped the steering wheel tighter. The street outside was eerily quiet, the sun sinking below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched toward him like fingers. There wasn't a soul in sight, just him, alone in front of a house that now felt more like a tomb. With a deep breath, Darius tried to steady himself. He couldn't sit here forever. The police would be on their way, but something in his gut told him there was more going on than he could explain to an officer in a simple report, and whoever, or whatever, had been in that house knew he had seen something. The question now was, what did they plan to do about it? His phone buzzed in his pocket, jolting him back to reality. With a shaky hand, he pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from Raina, his best friend since childhood, and the closest thing he had to family in this town. "Hey, you okay? Haven't heard from you in a while. Want to grab dinner?" For a moment, Darius just stared at the message, his mind too scattered to formulate a response. He wanted to tell her everything. About Mrs. Thompson, about the shadowy presence he'd felt in the house. But he knew it would sound insane. How could he even begin to explain what had just happened without sounding like a lunatic? He shook his head, quickly typing back a response. "Sorry, busy right now. I'll call you later." His thumb hovered over the send button before he hesitated. Something about the situation felt off. Raina was his closest friend, but suddenly the idea of seeing anyone, of putting anyone else at risk, made his stomach twist with unease. The shadows inside Mrs. Thompson's house weren't done with him yet. He could feel it in his bones. He deleted the message and shoved his phone back into his pocket. His mind flickered back to the knife, still wrapped in the cloth he had left on the coffee table. The police were going to find it, but the thought of leaving it there unsettled him. What if they never connected it to Mrs. Thompson's death? What if the knife was meant for something else? Something more sinister. Darius shook his head, trying to clear the growing cloud of paranoia. He was just a handyman, a guy who fixed leaky faucets and replaced broken tiles. He wasn't a detective, wasn't trained to deal with any of this. But the longer he sat there, the more he realized he couldn't just walk away. Something about this situation demanded action, even if it was the last thing he wanted to do. The hum of the van's engine vibrated through the silence as Darius clenched the steering wheel, considering his options. Going back into the house felt like suicide, but the thought of leaving that knife, and the mystery surrounding Mrs. Thompson's death, unsolved, gnawed at him. He had to make a choice, and fast. Just as he reached for the gear shift, ready to drive away and leave this nightmare behind, a flicker of movement caught his eye. His heart jumped into his throat as he turned to see a shadow shift in the upstairs window of Mrs. Thompson's house. Someone was watching him. The figure moved back from the window, disappearing into the gloom before Darius could make out any details. His stomach turned to ice. Whoever it was, they knew he was still there. His pulse quickened, his fight-or-flight instincts screaming at him to leave. But something else stirred inside him. A stubborn resolve, a refusal to let fear drive him away. Darius had lived his whole life being cautious, staying out of trouble, keeping to himself. But Mrs. Thompson had been kind to him. She had been a fixture in the neighborhood, always bringing him cookies when he worked on her house, always waving hello with a bright smile. He couldn't let her death become another unsolved mystery, another tragic story forgotten by everyone except the few who had cared about her. His decision made, Darius turned off the van's engine and stepped out into the cooling evening air. Every instinct screamed at him to get back inside and lock the doors, but he forced himself to walk, slowly, purposefully, toward the front door of the house. The shadows inside seemed to deepen as he approached, as if the house itself was alive, breathing in the twilight. His fingers trembled as he reached for the doorknob, but he clenched his jaw, refusing to let fear stop him now. He had to see this through. The door creaked open once again, and the familiar scent of dust and age hit him like a wave. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamps outside. His footsteps echoed unnervingly as he stepped inside, the air around him heavy with a tension that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. "Is anyone here?" His voice felt small in the oppressive silence, and he immediately regretted speaking. He took a step forward, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The silence stretched on, broken only by the creaking of the old house settling around him. Darius's heartbeat thundered in his ears as he moved further into the hallway, his shoes crunching softly on the debris scattered across the floor. Every shadow seemed to shift, as if hiding some unseen danger just beyond his sight. The living room came into view again, and there, on the coffee table where he had left it, was the knife, still wrapped in the cloth, untouched. A wave of relief washed over him for a brief second, but it was short-lived. The sense of being watched, of not being alone in this house, grew stronger with every passing moment. Darius's eyes flicked toward the staircase at the far end of the hallway, the one leading to the upstairs bedrooms. The figure he had seen watching him had been up there, in the room that had once belonged to Mrs. Thompson's late husband. Dread coiled in his stomach, but curiosity tugged at him, urging him to uncover the truth. With a deep breath, he steeled himself and began to ascend the stairs. Each step creaked under his weight, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness of the house. As he reached the landing, the air grew colder, the chill biting into his skin despite the lingering heat of the evening outside. The hallway upstairs was even darker than the one below, the dim light barely penetrating the thick shadows. Darius moved cautiously, his senses on high alert. The door to Mr. Thompson's old study was closed, but he knew that was where the figure had been. He stood in front of the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The thought of what might be on the other side made his heart race, but he had come this far. He had to know. Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, Darius grasped the doorknob and turned it. The door swung open with a soft creak, revealing the study beyond. The room was filled with shadows, but there was enough light to make out the shape of a figure standing by the window. Darius froze. The figure was tall and gaunt, its outline barely discernible in the darkness. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Darius could feel its eyes on him, watching, waiting. His breath hitched in his throat as he took a cautious step forward. "Who are you?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough to break the silence. The figure shifted, turning slowly to face him. And as it did, Darius felt a cold dread unlike anything he had ever experienced before. The shadows seemed to peel away, revealing a face twisted and gaunt, eyes hollow and sunken, as if the life had been drained from it long ago. The figure smiled, a grotesque, unnatural grin that sent a wave of nausea through Darius. Its voice was a whisper, barely more than a breath. But the words chilled him to the core. "She's not the only one." Before Darius could react, the figure lunged forward, its hands outstretched, reaching for him with a speed that defied its emaciated appearance. Panic surged through Darius as he stumbled back, his heart slamming against his ribs. He turned and bolted for the stairs, his mind screaming at him to run, to get out of the house before it was too late. Behind him, the figure's footsteps echoed, a relentless pursuit as it closed the distance between them. The haunting chase. Darius barely felt his feet hit the steps as he raced down the staircase. His lungs burned, his vision narrowing into a tunnel of pure panic as the heavy thud of footsteps behind him grew louder. Whatever the figure was, it was fast, faster than it had any right to be, given its frail appearance. His mind raced as quickly as his legs, trying to comprehend what he was dealing with. A ghost? A demon? No rational explanation fit the terror that had taken hold of him. He hit the bottom of the stairs and careened through the hallway, the air thick with the oppressive weight of the house itself pressing down on him. The front door loomed ahead, just within reach. If he could make it outside, maybe he could escape. Maybe the thing wouldn't follow him into the open. But as Darius reached for the door, the temperature around him plummeted, and a force unlike anything he had ever felt slammed into him from behind. It was as if the very shadows themselves had come alive, wrapping around his chest and yanking him backward, away from the door and into the depths of the house once more. He screamed, partly in fear, partly in pain, as the icy grip tightened, dragging him toward the living room. His fingers scraped against the doorframe, desperate for something to hold on to, but the relentless pull of the unseen force was too strong. The room seemed to warp around him as he was flung to the floor. His body hit the ground hard, knocking the wind from his lungs. Gasping for breath, Darius struggled to push himself up, but the force held him down, pinning him to the cold wooden floor. The knife, still wrapped in the cloth, lay just a few feet away on the coffee table, taunting him. But he couldn't move, couldn't reach it. The figure appeared at the edge of his vision, gliding into the room with eerie grace. It was even more horrifying up close, its skin a sickly gray, stretched taut over bone, its eyes deep, empty voids that seemed to drink in the surrounding light. Its smile was wide, unnatural, as if its lips had been carved into a permanent grimace of malice. "You shouldn't have come back," it rasped, its voice a hollow whisper that seemed to echo from all directions at once. "This is not your place." Darius's heart hammered in his chest as he stared up at the thing. It wasn't human, at least, not anymore. There was something otherworldly about it, something that defied explanation. And yet, he couldn't help but feel that it had once been like him, alive, normal, before whatever curse this place had taken hold. Summoning what little strength he had left, Darius managed to force his body to move, inching toward the coffee table and the knife. He didn't know why, but some instinct told him that the blade held the key to surviving this nightmare. His fingers brushed the edge of the table, trembling as he reached for the cloth-wrapped weapon. The figure's head tilted unnervingly as it watched him, as though amused by his feeble attempts at escape. "Do you think that will help you?" it whispered, its voice curling around his thoughts like a venomous snake. "It can't save you. Nothing can." Ignoring the figure's taunts, Darius gritted his teeth and lunged for the knife. His hand closed around the cloth just as the figure moved, its skeletal fingers reaching for him with inhuman speed. But Darius was faster this time. With a desperate yell, he tore the knife from its wrappings and slashed wildly through the air. To his shock, the blade connected. The figure let out a piercing, inhuman shriek as the knife cut through its outstretched hand. Black, oily ichor sprayed from the wound, sizzling as it hit the floor. The force holding Darius down loosened, and he scrambled to his feet, backing away from the creature as it writhed in pain. The sight was grotesque, its form flickering in and out of existence like a glitch in reality, struggling to hold itself together. The knife, it hurt the thing. Without wasting another second, Darius gripped the knife tightly and lunged forward, slashing again. The blade tore through the figure's torso, and another horrible scream filled the room, shaking the walls. The creature staggered backward, its form flickering faster now, as if it was unraveling, coming apart at the seams. You don't understand," it hissed, its voice faltering, broken by the strain of its own unraveling. "This is bigger than you." Darius didn't stop. He swung the knife again and again, each strike cutting deeper into the thing's shadowy form. With each blow, the creature seemed to lose more of its grip on the physical world, its body dissolving into a thick, black mist that swirled around the room. And then, with one final desperate scream, it was gone. The room fell silent, the oppressive weight that had clung to the air lifting as the last of the mist evaporated into nothingness. Darius stood there, panting, the knife still clutched in his hand, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. For a moment, he couldn't believe it was over. The silence was almost deafening after the chaos of the last few minutes. He dropped the knife onto the floor and staggered back, his legs barely able to hold him up. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had he really just fought off some kind of ghost? Demon? He didn't know, and honestly, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. All that mattered was that it was gone, and he was still alive. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, a new sensation crept over him, an unsettling sense that this wasn't the end. The figure's words echoed in his mind. "This is bigger than you." A cold dread settled in his gut. What had it meant? Was there more to this than just Mrs. Thompson's house? More than just a random haunting? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of creaking wood behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The house, which had been eerily still after the creature's demise, was once again stirring. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift and writhe, as if the very structure of the house was alive, responding to something unseen. The temperature in the room dropped again, and Darius's breath came out in visible puffs of mist. His hand instinctively reached for the knife on the floor, but before he could pick it up, the ground beneath him trembled. The house groaned, its ancient wooden beams creaking under some invisible pressure. Then, the floorboards in the center of the room began to split. Darius's eyes widened in horror as a dark crack spread across the floor, like a wound opening in the earth. From the crack, a faint, ominous glow began to seep out, red and sickly, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The glow pulsed, like a heartbeat, slow and steady. Something was coming. Darius backed away, his mind screaming at him to get out, to run. But he was frozen in place, his body betraying him as the crack in the floor widened, the glow intensifying. A low, guttural growl echoed up from the depths, followed by a distant, almost rhythmic sound, like chanting, but in a language he couldn't understand. And then he saw them. Dozens of eyes, yellow, glowing, filled with malice, peering up at him from the crack in the floor. They blinked in unison, watching him with a hunger that made his skin crawl. Whatever was beneath the house, whatever had been trapped there for who knows how long, was waking up. The figure had been just the beginning. The ground shook harder now, and the crack widened further, threatening to swallow the entire living room. Darius's survival instincts finally kicked in, and he turned and ran for the front door, not daring to look back. He could feel the house collapsing around him, the walls bending and warping as if they were made of putty. Just as he reached the door, a deafening roar filled the air, shaking the entire house to its foundation. The crack behind him erupted, spewing forth a wave of red light and dark energy that surged through the hallway like a tidal wave. Darius threw himself out the door just as the house behind him exploded in a cacophony of noise and light. The force of the blast sent him flying across the yard, his body slamming into the pavement with bone-jarring force. Pain shot through him, but he didn't care. He was alive. He had made it out. He rolled onto his back, gasping for air as he stared up at the sky. The night was calm, eerily peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But as he glanced back at the house, he saw the red glow still emanating from the shattered windows, flickering like the last dying embers of a fire. And from within that glow, he heard the distant sound of footsteps, approaching, slow and deliberate. Something had been unleashed, and it wasn't finished with him yet. The unleashed shadows. Darius lay there on the pavement, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths, every muscle in his body aching from the impact. The night was eerily still now, the only sound the faint crackle of debris settling inside the ruined house. His mind swirled in a haze of fear and disbelief. He had survived, but something much worse had just been set free. For a brief, fragile moment, Darius allowed himself to hope that it was over, that the house had collapsed upon itself, burying whatever ancient horror had been trapped within. But then, like a cold whisper on the back of his neck, the oppressive feeling of being watched washed over him again. He forced himself to sit up, wincing from the pain shooting through his ribs. His gaze shifted to the smoldering ruins of the house. The walls were gone, blown apart by whatever force had erupted from beneath, and in their place was an unnatural, swirling darkness. It wasn't just shadows, but something far more sinister. It felt alive, pulsating, shifting in ways that defied logic. The ground beneath the house had cracked open, forming a jagged chasm that led down into a pitch-black void. And from that void, the sickly red glow continued to pulse, like the beating heart of something ancient and malevolent. Darius slowly got to his feet, his legs trembling as if they could give out at any moment. He took a cautious step toward the house, his mind screaming at him to run the other way. But he couldn't. Some dark, morbid curiosity held him in place, his eyes fixated on the void. He had to know. What had he unleashed? Suddenly, the red glow intensified, casting grotesque shadows across the street. The shadows twisted and writhed, moving unnaturally as though they had a will of their own. Darius felt a chill race down his spine. These were no ordinary shadows. They were something else, something born of the same evil that had claimed the house. Then, from the chasm, the ground began to tremble once more. Low, rumbling sounds echoed up from the abyss, like the guttural breathing of a slumbering beast now wide awake. The oppressive force that had knocked Darius to the ground earlier returned, pressing against him with even more intensity, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, shapes began to emerge from the shadows, twisted, grotesque figures that seemed to be made of the darkness itself. They were vaguely humanoid, but their forms were distorted, elongated, as if they had been warped by whatever cursed power lay beneath the house. Their eyes, dozens of them, glowing a sickly yellow, blinked in the night, fixed on Darius with a hunger that made his blood run cold. They moved with a terrible grace, gliding toward him with silent, fluid motions. Their bodies flickered in and out of focus, like shadows cast by a flickering flame. They didn't walk. They floated, their feet never touching the ground. Darius's heart pounded in his chest as the creatures advanced, their forms growing more distinct with each passing second. Their eyes, unblinking, locked onto him, their intention clear. They were coming for him. Panic surged through Darius's body. He turned and bolted down the street, his feet slamming against the pavement as he pushed his aching body to move faster. Behind him, he could hear the creatures, moving too quickly, too fluidly, their approach like a cold wind chasing him through the darkness. The distance between him and the pursuing figures seemed to close far too fast. His mind raced, searching for a plan. He needed help, someone who could understand this madness. The police? No, they wouldn't believe him. They couldn't. How could anyone? And what would they do against this nightmare? But then it hit him. Father Callahan, the old priest who had lived in the outskirts of town, known for his strange ways and whispered to have dealt with the occult in his younger years. Growing up, Darius had heard stories about the priest's battles with the supernatural. He had always dismissed them as small-town folklore, but now, with his life hanging in the balance, he clung to those tales like a lifeline. He darted into an alleyway, his mind filled with only one thought. He had to reach the church before these things caught up to him. The alley was a narrow maze of garbage bins, rusting fire escapes, and flickering streetlights. His footsteps echoed sharply as he ran, the sound bouncing off the brick walls. But no matter how fast he ran, the creatures were faster. They didn't make a sound, but he could feel their presence, like icy fingers brushing against the back of his neck. The air grew colder still, and a strange heaviness settled around him, making it harder to move. Darius pushed forward, teeth clenched, every muscle in his body straining. Just ahead, at the end of the alley, he could see the faint outline of the church spire rising above the rooftops. He was close. so close. Then, out of nowhere, the shadows shifted in front of him. One of the creatures emerged, materializing from the darkness like a nightmare-given form. It moved with terrifying speed, cutting off his escape. Darius skidded to a halt, his heart pounding. He had no weapon, no way to defend himself. The knife he'd used in the house was long gone, left behind in the chaos. He was unarmed, trapped between the thing blocking his path and the others closing in from behind. The creature in front of him tilted its head, the glowing yellow orbs that passed for its eyes narrowing in a way that suggested amusement. It raised one of its long, clawed hands and reached toward him. Instinct took over. Darius dove to the side, crashing into a pile of old crates and scattering debris in every direction. The creature's hand missed him by inches, slashing through the air where his head had been. He scrambled to his feet and took off again, darting down a narrow side street, the church now directly ahead. Behind him, he could hear the creatures following, their movements faster now, more aggressive. They were toying with him, he realized, driving him into a corner like a pack of wolves herding prey. Darius's breath came in ragged gasps as he reached the church steps. His legs felt like they were on fire, his lungs screaming for air, but he didn't stop. He threw himself at the heavy wooden doors, slamming into them with his full weight. "Father Callahan," he shouted, pounding on the door with both fists. "Father, open up, please." For a moment, there was no response. Panic gripped him as he glanced over his shoulder. The creatures had reached the edge of the churchyard, their forms barely visible in the shadows cast by the streetlights. They didn't cross the iron fence that surrounded the church, but they lingered, watching, waiting. Darius pounded on the door again, harder this time. "Please." At last, the door creaked open, and an old man in a faded priest's robe appeared in the doorway. Father Callahan's face was pale and weathered, his eyes sharp despite his age. He took one look at Darius, then passed him at the creatures gathering at the edge of the yard, and his expression darkened. "Get inside," the priest said, his voice grim. He pulled Darius into the church and slammed the door shut, bolting it with several heavy locks. Darius collapsed onto one of the pews, gasping for breath, his body trembling with exhaustion and fear. What are those things?" He managed to choke out between gasps. Father Callahan didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked to the front of the church and lit several candles, their flickering flames casting long shadows on the walls. He turned back to Darius, his face grim and lined with years of hidden knowledge. "They are the shadows of the past," the priest said slowly. "The remnants of a curse that has plagued this town for generations. They're tied to that house, to the evil that was buried beneath it long ago." Darius shook his head. "I don't understand. Why did they come after me?" "Because you opened the door," Father Callahan replied, his voice heavy with regret. "You broke the seal that kept them imprisoned. And now, they want something far worse than just your life." Darius felt a chill run through him. What do they want? The priest's gaze met his, and in that moment, Darius saw the depth of the terror that even Father Callahan couldn't hide. "They want to finish what they started centuries ago," the priest said quietly. "They want to break free completely. And once they do, no one will be safe." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the flickering of the candles. Darius's mind raced, struggling to process everything he'd just heard. The creatures outside weren't just after him. They were after something much bigger, something that threatened not just him, but everyone. And the worst part, he had no idea how to stop it.